Imagine being slapped with a $2,300 fine and an arrest warrant simply for sleeping under a blanket in a public park.
Yeah, and that is not some exaggerated worst-case scenario. That is a documented reality written directly into the law.
Right, because the reality of homelessness varies wildly from state to state. The legal landscape, the geographic challenges, the available resources, what you see in one zip code can be entirely different from what you encounter just across the state line.
Exactly.
So today, you are building the perfectly homeless state scorecard for Kentucky. And this is going to be a dynamic, documentary-style process. We will be evaluating 6 specific categories based strictly on lived realities and systems.
And just so you know, the score will evolve dynamically throughout this deep dive. The final result won't be revealed until the very end.
Yeah, it's an evolving picture. So to build this scorecard accurately for you, we have to start with the state overview. We need to establish the baseline scale.
Right. So according to the 2025 K count, which is the state's federally mandated point-in-time assessment, Kentucky recorded 5,789 unhoused people on a single night.
Wow. Over 5,000.
Yeah. And out of that total, 34.5%, or, nearly 2,000 individuals, were entirely unsheltered.
Meaning they were living in places officially designated as not meant for human habitation.
Exactly.
And who exactly makes up that number? Because the demographics are shifting rapidly.
Yeah, it really are. The data shows major growth among families with children, unaccompanied youth, and the elderly as well.
And there's a stark racial disparity present in these numbers, too. Black Kentuckians make up roughly 12 to 13% of the state's general population, but they account for over 31% of the unhoused population.
That's right. And geography also heavily dictates how the system operates and who actually receives assistance.
You have the overwhelmed urban centers, specifically Louisville and Lexington, managing the highest raw numbers.
Yeah, but outside of those cities, you find these vast service deserts throughout rural Kentucky where dedicated resources are, honestly, practically non-existent.
Wait, let me ask you to clarify that rural aspect.
Yeah.
Because it's so different from what you typically see on the news. How does this hidden rural homelessness actually function on a daily basis compared to, urban street homelessness?
Well, it really comes down to geography and visibility. In an urban center, an encampment on a city sidewalk is highly visible.
Right. It's right there in front of you.
Yeah, and that visibility forces a municipal response, whether that is sanitation, outreach, or policing. But in rural areas, individuals are geographically isolated. They are sleeping in dense woodlands, abandoned agricultural structures, or dispersed encampments miles from any town center.
So because they aren't visible to the general public, the sheer scale of the population just goes unrecognized.
Precisely. And when the population is unrecognized, state funding mechanisms simply do not allocate resources or physical infrastructure to those specific areas.
Right. So let's look at how people end up in those woodlands or on those city sidewalks in the first place. Let's begin the evaluation with Category 1, housing affordability.
Okay, so Kentucky is facing a severe, documented housing shortage that pushes residents directly to the brink.
Yeah, if you look at specific regional data, Boone County currently faces a 22% gap between the number of housing units needed and the number of current households.
And in Rowan County, local economic development councils report a hard deficit of over 1,000 housing units.
1,000 units.
Yeah.
So if you are renting in one of these areas, the lived reality is that you are teetering on the edge of eviction every single month.
Yeah. And in small growing towns like Moorhead, for example, this pressure is exacerbated by landlord monopolies.
Right. Tenant organizers report that in some of these communities, just a few individuals own the vast majority of rental properties.
Exactly. So think about the step-by-step mechanism of losing your housing in that specific monopolized environment. If a tenant is evicted or, their lease is simply not renewed by one of those few property owners, the lack of available, affordable alternative means they have nowhere else to go within their own town.
They cannot just move down the street.
No. They transition immediately from a housed state to an unhoused state. The systemic failure to produce adequate housing units directly fuels those baseline K-count numbers we just talked about.
Yeah, this tight squeeze forces families directly into the streets without a safety net.
Hmm.
So evaluating this systemic bottleneck, this lowers the overall picture for the state.
It definitely does.
Let's move to Category 2, shelter access. Because if you get squeezed out of the housing market by those deficits, your immediate next step is trying to find an emergency shelter.
Right.
But the math is stark. We just established there are 5,789 unhoused people in the state. However, The state only possesses 3,656 year-round emergency shelter beds.
which creates a hard mathematical deficit of 1,575 beds.
Yeah. And the real-world conditions reflect that deficit every single night. Shelters in Jefferson County operate at full capacity.
And the emergency shelter of Northern Kentucky, which operates in Covington, is a prime example of this strain. They have just 68 beds for men year-round and reserve 16 beds for women during the winter months.
Only 16 for women.
Yeah, just in winter. They are forced to turn people away daily simply because the physical square footage does not exist to house them.
Wait, before we go further into their numbers, the documentation refers to that Covington location as a low-barrier facility. What exactly makes a shelter low-barrier, and why does that matter for this scorecard?
So a low-barrier shelter deliberately minimizes the requirements for entry. They do not mandate sobriety, criminal background checks, or, participation in specific religious programs just to get a bed for the night.
Okay. So the mechanism is designed to bring the most vulnerable, hard-to-reach people inside immediately.
Exactly. But even with those removed barriers, this specific Covington shelter saw a 44% increase between 2023 and 2024 in overnight guests reporting homelessness for the very first time.
That is a massive jump.
Yeah. And furthermore, despite providing this critical public service, the shelter relies on private donors for 87% of its funding.
Wow. And the director of that Northern Kentucky shelter actually pointed out a striking statutory comparison in the research. All 120 Kentucky counties require a taxpayer-funded animal shelter by law.
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
But there is absolutely no corresponding legal requirement for human shelters anywhere in the state.
Well, legislation was recently introduced to try and change that discrepancy. House Bill 299 was proposed during the 2025 regular session.
Right, and the intent was to require county governments to operate at least one emergency shelter with an adequate number of beds based on their local unhoused population.
But the bill failed in committee. This was largely due to opposition from the Kentucky Association of Counties, who cited the significant negative fiscal impact it would have on rural counties lacking the tax base to fund such a mandate.
So we are looking at a severe physical bottleneck where the infrastructure to house people simply does not match the population in need, and the legislative attempt to fix it failed due to rural funding constraints.
Exactly.
Based on this, the current draft score is taking shape.
Right. So for those following along, we are projecting a preliminary score overlay on screen right now. It is labeled clearly as draft score.
But I want to emphasize to you directly, this is not the final score. We are only at the midpoint of this deep dive. The upcoming categories covering legislation, enforcement, and outreach are critical, and they may significantly change this result.
Absolutely.
So let's follow the logical progression. You lose your housing, the shelters are completely full, or your county legally doesn't even have one. You are forced to sleep outside. That triggers Category 3, criminalization and enforcement.
Yeah. In July 2024, the Safer Kentucky Act, which is known as HB 5, went into effect.
And this law effectively bans street camping and the use of camp paraphernalia, explicitly listing items like sleeping bags and blankets in public areas.
Right. Now, the stated legislative intent of HB 5, according to its proponents, is to provide law enforcement with tools to address public encampments and to legally compel unhoused individuals toward treatment and shelter services.
But the lived reality, documented through judicial and police records, shows a distinctly punitive outcome. Within 1 year of the law taking effect, there were 425 unlawful camping charges filed in district courts across 30 different Kentucky counties.
And the specific citations really ground this reality in actual events. In Boyd County, police records show a person was cited for sleeping under a blanket in a park bandstand.
A blanket, just a blanket.
Yeah. And in Davies County, a woman was cited multiple times and eventually arrested for building a makeshift cardboard shelter out of boxes near a wood line.
And the enforcement of this statute creates a highly documented debt trap, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Let's walk through the exact step-by-step mechanism of how this happens. So, a first offense violation for unlawful camping carries a fine of up to $250.
Right.
And it requires a mandatory court appearance. But because unhoused individuals frequently lack transportation, reliable scheduling, or even a mailing address to receive notices, they often miss these court dates.
And missing that court date triggers a show cause arrest warrant, correct?
Yes.
Explain the mechanics of what that actually means for the person on the street.
A show cause warrant means the judge is ordering law enforcement to arrest the individual and bring them before the court to show cause or explain why they failed to appear.
Okay.
Once they are arrested on that warrant, the original unlawful camping charge escalates to a Class B misdemeanor.
Hang on, let me make sure I understand the logic here. A Class B misdemeanor in Kentucky carries up to 90 days in jail.
Exactly.
So a person who simply couldn't get a ride to the courthouse is now facing 3 months behind bars.
Yes, and the financial penalties escalate right alongside those criminal charges. By the time you factor in the original fine, court costs, booking fees, and failure to appear penalties, an individual can face a total debt of over $2,300.
Unbelievable. The state is attempting to address a population that literally cannot afford rent by putting them into a $2,300 hole. How does a $2,300 fine help someone buy a home or secure a lease?
It doesn't.
No, it doesn't. This penalty structure severely complicates the state's efforts. This shifts the score significantly.
It really does.
So if you can't sleep on the sidewalk or in a park without facing arrest, the natural next step for many is their car. Let's examine Category 4, vehicle dwelling friendliness.
Right. Under the Safer Kentucky Act, there is a specific carve-out for vehicular residency. Kentucky Revised Statute 511.110, Section 5, permits a person to sleep temporarily in a lawfully parked vehicle on a public road or lot.
Okay, that sounds promising.
But the statute strictly limits this to a period of less than 12 hours, and from a practical standpoint, service providers note this is functionally unworkable.
Right, because it forces individuals to constantly uproot. You have to physically move your vehicle every 12 hours just to avoid a citation, which wastes extremely limited gas money and exponentially increases the risk of mechanical breakdowns.
And if the vehicle does break down or is parked illegally due to a lack of options, towing policies heavily impact this population.
Yeah, when a municipality tows a vehicle for unpaid parking or expired registration debt, the consequences are total.
Exactly. If you are living in your car, you don't just lose your transportation to work. You simultaneously lose your shelter and all your personal belongings.
And furthermore, the daily impound storage fees accumulate so rapidly that it becomes financially impossible for a low-income individual to ever retrieve that vehicle.
But we are seeing direct community pushback against these restrictions.
Yeah, we are. In Lexington, faith leaders from the Consolidated Baptist Church and the Catholic Action Center have organized what they call sanctuary parking.
Right. By opening up their privately owned church parking lots, they provide a legal space where vehicular unhoused families can sleep overnight without violating the public property bans outlined in HB 5.
It is a critical grassroots intervention. Because the property is private and the owners grant explicit permission, the 12-hour public road limits do not apply, offering temporary, uninterrupted stability.
Yeah, that stability is huge.
Seeing the community step up and provide physical sanctuary where state systems fail is a crucial data point. This raises the overall picture.
It does, but that sanctuary is limited to a few specific parking lots.
Right. For the rest of the state, especially with strict enforcement measures in place, how do social workers actually reach people? This leads us directly into Category 5, outreach and social services.
Well, the enforcement of HB 5 has massively intensified the invisible homelessness effect we discussed at the beginning of the episode.
Oh, right.
Yeah. In rural areas like Moorhead and Ashland, individuals are actively fleeing deeper into the dense woods, specifically to avoid arrest or citation.
Wow. So outreach organizations, such as the Gateway Homeless Coalition and a group called More Love in Moorhead, report that their target populations are becoming increasingly difficult to locate.
Exactly. These groups rely on specific events, like community Thanksgiving dinners and mobile health clinics, just to build trust.
Yeah. Gateway House, for example, operates a shelter with only 17 beds to cover a massive multi-county rural area. So they partner with a local hospital and the university to conduct mobile medical outreach.
But the fear of criminalization acts as an insurmountable physical barrier to that medical care. Case managers document that individuals are absolutely terrified to access these mobile clinics or to officially identify themselves as unhoused.
The exact mechanism of this fear is pretty simple, isn't it? They believe that engaging with a highly visible, government-affiliated clinic will inevitably lead to law enforcement involvement.
Yes, they fear it will result in an arrest for camp paraphernalia, a missed court date, and the loss of what little physical stability they have managed to secure out in the woods.
That is just heartbreaking. So, when individuals hide from law enforcement to avoid a $2,300 fine, they're simultaneously forced to hide from the very social workers trying to assist them. When the system actively drives people away from life-saving medical care, this lowers the overall picture for the state.
It definitely lowers the picture.
We now turn to our final evaluation metric, Category 6, pathways to permanent housing. We have to look at how people actually escape this cycle.
Right, we must contrast the punitive measures with the actual administrative pathways operating in the state. Louisville Metro instituted an unlawful camping diversion program, which is funded by $700,000 from a state opioid settlement.
Okay, and this specialized court docket is designed to dismiss unlawful camping charges, provided that the unhoused individuals engage with case managers and complete housing assessments.
Yes, it is a direct administrative attempt to stop the cycle of criminalization.
However, the data shows a severe flaw in this pathway.
Yeah, it does.
Even when individuals successfully complete the diversion program and get their charges dismissed, they remain unhoused. Why? Because the actual affordable housing units, the ones we discussed way back in Category 1, simply do not exist to place them in.
Right. The cycle continues because the physical endpoint is missing.
Exactly.
For comparison, we can look at regional innovations operating just across the river. Cincinnati Public Schools opened a safe sleep lot at Taft Elementary specifically for families living in their vehicles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, by providing a secure, monitored lot directly on school grounds, the school district can verify a family as homeless under federal guidelines within 24 hours.
Wait, before we go further, the research specifically tied this kind of school initiative to something called the McKinney-Vento data. Can you define what that is? Because it seems crucial to understanding how families escape homelessness long-term.
Absolutely. The McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act is federal legislation ensuring educational rights and protections for children experiencing homelessness. It requires schools to rigorously track data on unhoused students and immediately remove administrative barriers to their enrollment. Cincinnati's Safe Sleep Lot utilizes this exact framework. Immediate verification through the school fast-tracks these families into permanent housing assistance while ensuring the children remain enrolled and attending class every day.
That makes total sense. And the economics of prioritizing housing over enforcement are mathematically clear, too.
They really are.
The Housing First model demonstrates that chronic homelessness costs taxpayers over $35,000 a year per person in emergency medical and penal services.
Yeah, compared to that, permanent supportive housing is consistently documented as the cheaper, more economically effective alternative to continuous police and emergency room intervention.
Right. So based on these administrative roadblocks and isolated successes, this shifts the score as we compile our final metrics.
Okay, so we have evaluated the scale of the population, the deficit of housing and shelter, the mechanical impact of recent legislation, the reality of vehicular residency, the physical challenges of rural outreach, and the existing pathways to permanent stability.
It is time for the final summary. Kentucky shows major strengths in grassroots innovations. The sanctuary parking initiatives, the diversion courts attempting to mitigate legal harms, and the highly dedicated nonprofits operating in rural service deserts demonstrate really strong community resilience.
But the major weaknesses are systemic and severe. There is a massive affordable housing deficit, a critical mathematically proven shortage of shelter beds, and a legislative framework that actively criminalizes the unhoused, pushing them into the woods and away from medical care.
Let's assign the specific grades. Housing affordability.
Based on the severe unit deficits and eviction pressures in monopolized markets, the grade is an F.
Shelter access.
Given the 1,575-bed deficit and the failure of state funding mandates, the grade is a D.
Criminalization and enforcement.
Driven by the strict outcomes of the Safer Kentucky Act and the resulting debt traps, the grade is an F.
Vehicle dwelling friendliness.
While despite the community sanctuary efforts, the restrictive 12-hour laws and devastating towing impacts result in a D.
Outreach and social services.
The dedication of the workers is incredibly high, but the legal environment forces populations into hiding, severely limiting access to care, earning C.
Pathways to permanent housing.
The lack of available units at the end of diversion programs results in a D.
Compiling these metrics, we reveal the final, perfectly homeless state score for Kentucky, a 3 out of 10.
Yeah.
The state receives this score because, despite localized humanitarian efforts, the systemic hurdles, a severe lack of physical housing combined with state-level policies that penalize individuals for existing in public space, create an environment where escaping homelessness is administratively and financially improbable.
But before we conclude, consider the long-term generational impact of that McKinney-Vento data we discussed.
Right.
We know from this tracking that unhoused children are 4 times more likely to experience homelessness as adults. They fall years behind academically and face severe compounding health risks.
Wow.
The enforcement policies and housing deficits enacted today aren't just managing current public space, they are actively writing the economic future of the state's next generation.
That's the perfectly homeless state score for Kentucky. Let us know which state you would like to see next in the comments, and please hit that like button. It really helps push this content out to other viewers. Until next time, dwell well, and we'll see you in the next state. This is a 50-state journey through how America actually treats people without housing, and every state tells a different story. If you'd like to support the project, visit the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and pick up a PH hoodie. Every purchase helps fund future episodes and keeps these stories in front of the public. Wear the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore. It's happening in every state, every city, and more neighborhoods than most people realize. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next state.